I've been asked to say a word about this book of mine, which has just been published. Perhaps a first comment is that I'm getting positive feedback about the cover, if not the content. This cover is from a painting by Salvador Dali that's found in Glasgow. I was lucky to get the copyright to be able to use it, but I believe it captures a lot of the meaning of the book, because it really is a painting about redeeming history. Christ crucified and more or less risen, hovering over the world and being an influence for the redemption of the world. I believe that's the meaning of this painting, and it's also the meaning of this book. So this book, as you see, is called, it's subtitled Social Concern in Bernard Lonergan and Robert Doran. Its intended audience is not for complete beginners. I'm assuming a certain background in philosophy and theology, and hopefully even a certain competence, a certain background in the thought of Bernard Lonergan, at least, if not Robert Doran. The basic theme of the book is that Lonergan had a deep social concern that motivated his work through his life, but it's easily missed. So there's a paradox here. And I talk about 5 reasons why it's easy to miss the social concern of Lonergan. And I'll explain why I end up talking about Robert Doran as well. The first reason, I use my slides here. So the first reason is that the works where Lonergan most demonstrates that social concern motivates him are very early in his career, and they were not published, these works. Lonergan was born in 1904, so up to the 1940s, he's producing these works on a philosophy of history and macroeconomics. And on this matter, he was trying to parallel the thought of Karl Marx, who produced also a philosophy of history and a theory of economics. So for a Catholic in the 1930s, 1940s, very concerned, deeply concerned about the poverty of the Great Depression, for example, about the fact of the rise of fascism, Nazism, and the Second World War. He had a feeling of the crisis of civilization, along with many other intellectuals at that time. And he felt that his contribution could be this Catholic parallel to Karl Marx that included a philosophy of history and a theory of macroeconomics. Now, the next point, my second reason for missing the social concern of Lonergan, is probably my main point of this talk. It is that Lonergan went through a kind of crisis in the late 1940s, when in part he realized that nobody was reading his philosophy of history or his macroeconomics. But he also recognized that the more he thought about it, the more that one needed to address deeply philosophical issues before one could proceed to this philosophy of history or economic commitment. So he made a decision for the rest of his life to withdraw to these more foundational philosophical or methodological questions, so as to assist an eventual return to those concerns, either by himself in his older age or by others. This metaphor of withdrawal and return came from, in fact, from a historian, Toynbee was his name, writing in the 1920s and 30s, who said that many of the great figures in history who had really exercised an influence on changing civilizations had in their own lives conducted a period of withdrawal so as to rethink everything, you might say, and then to return to have an impact. Toynbee studies Jesus Christ, Muhammad, Buddha, and not only religious leaders, but there are certainly very clear examples of people who withdrew for an eventual return that worked, so to speak. Now, my next 2 reasons are, in a sense, less important. It's just to say that Lonergan carried out his project of withdrawal. Reason 3 is to say that his famous book, Insight, which he produced on epistemology and metaphysics, did have this aim, which was ultimately a social concern aim, but it's easy to miss the point, and I explain that in my book. I make a similar point about Lonergan's second great work, Method in Theology, which was produced in 1972. That you see, he's into theology now, which is helping to guide the church in its redemptive task in history. He's getting closer to his return, you might say. But nevertheless, it's a technical book that is hard to read in various ways, and at the end of the day, it's once again easy to miss that there is a social concern which motivates it. Now, my fifth reason is, you might say, the second major point of this talk. It is that Lonergan, I suggest, never actually finishes his withdrawal fully, let alone conducting a successful return to issues of social concern. I suggest that Robert Doran, his disciple, completed the foundational reflection by adding a notion of psychic conversion to Lonergan's notion of intellectual conversion. Now, of course, I explained that in the book, but I'm not able to do so now. But Doran brings a whole resource of psychoanalysis to the notion of self-appropriation that is central to Lonergan's philosophy. Furthermore, Doran engages very much with liberation theology. You see, he's a younger generation. He was exposed to the post-Vatican II liberation theology movement. He is not uncritical of liberation theology, but he nevertheless uses the profound foundations that he has developed based on Lonergan to articulate a notion of option for the poor and how we must use the situation as a source of theology. I won't go into all the details of that, but in my last chapter, I talk about how this very dense methodological reflection of Doran based on Lonergan is practical ultimately, because it provides tools that can be used to help in the redemption of history, whether you're a Christian or in fact even a social scientist that is open to the philosophy that is implicit in Lonergan and Doran's writings. So in the last chapter, I give two examples of people using Doran's thought practically. The first is an author, Neil Ormerod, who wrote a book on globalization. You might say redemption of history in a globalizing world, with a very careful study of many books written on the phenomenon of globalization. And that's obviously a macro vision. The second part of the final chapter is my own story of being a missionary in Africa, in a poor parish on the periphery of Nairobi, and how as pastor of that parish I used Doran's thinking to guide pastoral decision making. So anyway, the book concludes with 6 pages on Pope Francis. And I suggest that this method of Doran is a marvellous way of implementing the vision of Pope Francis himself. I have 2 final slides on that, which really talks about how this notion of option for the poor and treating the situation as a source of theology is just what Pope Francis is up to. So, thank you very much, and I hope you read this book.